This is a ReeTV documentary. JonBenet Ramsey. I've been sat here for over an hour trying to figure out how I'm going to start this video. And I have absolutely no idea how to do it without either letting my emotions get the better of me or being a hypocrite and not saying what I really think. But saying what I really think will probably get me banned, so I have to self-censor somewhat. This is JonBenet Ramsey. This picture literally makes me feel physically sick. And this isn't even one of the more suggestive pictures of her out there. And this poor little girl was exploited enough in her very short life. If you think this picture is just an innocent picture of a little girl dressed up ready for an innocent competition, then you are a huge part of the problem of what pain and abuse little JonBenet Ramsey had to endure in her very short 6 years on this earth. And you were happy to turn a blind eye because it doesn't directly affect you. For those of you that don't know or don't remember, JonBenet Ramsey was the beautiful little girl who was forced into beauty pageants by her mother, Patsy Ramsey, who won the Miss West Virginia pageant in 1977 at around aged 20.
I'm a junior at West Virginia University.
Here's JonBenet singing in a Boulder shopping mall just 3 days before she was found murdered in her home. JonBenet was found murdered in the basement of her home on Christmas of 1996. To this day, more than 20 years later, no one has been convicted of her murder. There are multiple theories about what happened to JonBenet from other interviews given by the Ramseys that there are numerous indications of early child abuse in both John and Patsy Ramsey's childhoods and indications of abuse towards JonBenet. So back to Christmas 1996. On Christmas Eve, the Ramseys hosted a party at their house in Boulder.
In the 35 years I've been doing this, I've never seen a case like the unsolved murder of JonBenet Ramsey.
Well, I have. Remember Madeleine McCann? The only difference between these cases is the location. Both sets of parents show signs of early childhood sexual abuse. Both show signs of sexual abuse against their children, and both staged a kidnapping. The McCanns have made millions off of the death of their child. Did they get tips from the Ramseys? And what about Charles Lindbergh's baby? And why is Jerry smiling?
The latest comes from the mountain town of Rollinsville, west of Boulder, a place where residents Bill and Janet McReynolds are known as Santa and Mrs. Claus.
Merry Christmas.
They had been at the Ramsey home 2 nights before the murder of 6-year-old JonBenet, entertaining at a Christmas party. Police recently realized some strange parallels. One of the McReynolds daughters and a friend of hers were abducted in Longmont in 1974. The McReynolds girl witnessed her friend's molestation, but nobody was ever arrested. It happened on December 26th. 22 years to the day before JonBenet's body was discovered in the basement of the Ramsey family home. And Janet McReynolds wrote a play in 1976 called Hey Rube. It was about the sexual assault, torture, and murder of a girl. The child's body was found in a basement. Janet McReynolds declined to be interviewed on camera this day, saying she doesn't want to add more to the speculation surrounding the murder. She also said they were cooperating with police, and has said that she believes the questioning and samples were for the purposes of exclusion. And there were also sensitive questions for this woman, Marilyn Vanderberg, a former Miss Colorado and Miss America who has revealed that she had been sexually abused by her father. Police wanted to know what kind of person would do such a thing.
I think it's very difficult for people to believe that incest, if it is, can be in such an outstanding, Hollywood-looking, perfect family. I know that it was true for me and my family.
If you look at the Ramsey case, this went far beyond what you would expect. There were more mistakes made in this case than any other case I've ever seen.
I believe that when the case first started, that it did look like the Ramseys did this.
Within a week, it was clear that the Boulder Police Department had made up its mind. It was someone in the household. Game, set, match.
John Ramsey and his wife had been under this cloud of suspicion ever since then.
They claim to have put JonBenet to bed in this very bedroom around 9 p.m. in their 3-story, 15-room mansion in Boulder, Colorado. And the next morning at 5 a.m., Patsy claims to have woken to find an extremely bizarre 3-page ransom note on the bottom step of the spiral staircase, claiming that JonBenet had been kidnapped. The ransom note asked for $118,000, which was exactly the amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. The note said the kidnapper would call between 8 and 10 a.m. with instructions, but that call never came. Sometime after the window for the call, Investigator Linda Arndt asked John Ramsey to check the house for anything that looked out of place or anything missing. John and a friend immediately headed to the basement of the house, and a few minutes later, John Ramsey returned carrying the body of JonBenet. He claimed to have found her in the back room of the basement.
Who suggested for you to search the house?
Linda Arndt. She said, take Fleet White with you and search the house, see if you notice anything out of the ordinary.
He should not have been allowed to search that house by himself. He could have tampered with evidence without even knowing that it was evidence. That's a critical mistake.
So where did you begin?
Went down to the basement.
Why start there?
It's the most logical entry point. Went into we called it the train room. The kids had a train set up in this. There was a window open. There was a suitcase sitting under the window, which shouldn't have been there. And I noted that, mentioned it to Fleet. I said, that shouldn't be there.
You knew there was a broken window downstairs, right?
Well, I had broken that glass and then opened the window to get in previous summer because I'd left my key and Patsy was gone. I thought we had it fixed, but we never went in the basement, so I didn't know that. So I wasn't surprised that the glass was broken, but I was surprised that the window was open.
So you come to this door and it's closed. And what's in that door?
Well, we called it the wine cellar, but there's never any wine in it. It was a junk room. I was just going through methodically every square inch of that basement. And I opened the door and there's JonBenet.
The investigator would later claim that when John returned with JonBenet's body and looked into her eyes, she knew in that moment that he had killed JonBenet.
I know who killed JonBenet. There's no doubt in my mind who killed JonBenet. And while this investigation is still ongoing, I don't think it's appropriate that I say that name out loud. And I see John Ramsey carrying JonBenet up the last 3 steps from the basement. And my mind exploded. And everything that I had noted that morning that stuck out instantly made sense. And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while. I ordered in to put JonBenet down. I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face. And John leaned down opposite me. And his face was just inches from mine. And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget. And he asked if she was dead. And I said, yes, she's dead. And I told him to go back to the room and to dial 911. And as we looked at each other, I remember, and I wore a shoulder holster, tucking my gun right next to me and consciously counting, I've got 18 bullets.
Why did you do that?
Because I didn't know if we'd all be alive when people showed up. I said everything made sense in that instance. And I knew what happened.
Do you think your fear was well-founded?
You bet I do. There's no doubt in my mind.
To this day?
Never wavered.
You were afraid because you thought the killer was still in the house.
I knew it.
Absolutely?
Absolutely.
Find on them now. We were kidnapped. Hurry, please.
About 20 minutes later, police arrived, followed by the FBI. For the next 6 hours, the Ramseys waited for the kidnapper's promised call. 2 different searches of the house turned up nothing.
It was a Boulder police officer, Linda Arndt, who told John to go with his friend Fleet White and search the house one time.
They get to the basement. They go down the hallway towards the wine cellar, and he hits the light switch. And he immediately sees his daughter wrapped in the blanket laying on the floor. He notices her hands are tied. There was a piece of duct tape across JonBenet's mouth. He sees a garrote around the neck. This was not a kidnapping. This was a murder.
You have a 2.5-page ransom note, a strangulation, sexual abuse. It just doesn't happen this way.
Strange story in Colorado where a 6-year-old girl thought to be a kidnap victim has been found dead. The child beauty queen was found in the basement of her family's home the day after Christmas.
It's also reported the girl was strangled with a noose-like cord and her mouth taped, and there were no signs of a break-in.
JonBenet Ramsey's skull was fractured on the right side of her head.
She'd been battered, strangled, and sexually abused.
There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the snow. The rope used to choke JonBenet was tightened with a paintbrush from her mother's hobby kit. An alleged ransom note was written on a pad of paper from inside the house.
The brutal killing of a pageant princess is raising troubling questions in many minds about child beauty contests.
I think the JonBenet Ramsey case would have stayed a local story if it wasn't for one element. And that was those pageant videos that were released within a few days after the tragedy. Those videos showed a certain amount of sexuality from a young child.
People try to make it seem ugly and something that it wasn't. And I just know how much fun it was. What a good time we had together.
There were some negative connotations to these images, you know, whether the child had been pushed too far and whether this was symptomatic of some end result that caused the death of the child.
For 2 weeks now in Boulder, Colorado, an American tragedy has been unfolding. Tonight, no new clues in the search for answers.
The setting for this murder was not typical. Very affluent, exclusive neighborhood, beautiful multi-million-dollar home. All of these things led many people to believe, well, there can't be a bad guy walking around a place like that. It must be the parents or her brother.
The evidence that points to the Ramseys, I think, is the fact that they were in the house at the time of the murder.
Immediately, suspicion fell on the family, but the parents and son Burke always proclaimed their innocence.
The list of suspects narrows. Soon, there will be no one on the list but you.
JonBenet Ramsey's parents hired attorneys shortly after their 6-year-old child was murdered and have communicated with police only through legal representatives.
It has been said that you and Patsy did not cooperate with the police, that you, in fact, obstructed this investigation.
Well, it's totally false. Police came to our home, and we talked to them for, seemed like hours. And they started this, well, we need you to come down to the police station. And that by now we had media trucks out in front, and Patsy was in no condition to be moved. She was in bad shape.
As we've been reporting, police in Boulder, Colorado finally have begun full-length interrogations of the little girl's parents.
I'm talking about scientific evidence.
I don't give a flying flip how scientific it is. Go back to the damn drawing board. I didn't do it.
They were still suspects in the eyes of the public and the police, who continued to focus almost exclusively on them, particularly Patsy.
The theory was that JonBenet was killed by Patsy over bedwetting, and that the garrote was constructed for some reason to make it look like it was a kidnap killing gone bad. That was all part of the staging.
The garrote had intricate, complex, even unusual knotting. Someone knew what they were doing.
There are several key people investigators would like to question. Tops on the list, John and Patsy Ramsey, as well as their son Bert.
Just listen one more time to the way JonBenet describes Patsy.
Patsy was in no condition to be moved.
Patsy was in no condition to be moved. To be moved? What a bizarre way to describe his wife in this circumstance.
Patsy was in no condition to be moved.
It's a massive red flag that if JonBenet was in fact wetting the bed, this is another very worrying sign that she was indeed being sexually abused. An abused child will often wet the bed to deter the abuser or just out of sheer fear of what has happened or is about to happen.
The theory was that JonBenet was killed by Patsy over bedwetting.
I hadn't seen savagery done to a child or even an adult until the doctor peeled back her scalp and saw that horrific fracture to her head. It was the length of her head. She had trauma to her vagina.
What kind of trauma?
It would be trauma that would be consistent with injuries seen in sexual assault cases.
Recently?
I would guess the best way to say that was what was seen was not a first-time injury.
The coroner, in fact, said the evidence was inconclusive, but ABC News has confirmed that 3 medical experts who consulted for the Boulder Police Department concluded the injuries were consistent with prior sexual abuse.
JonBenet had died from strangulation and blunt force trauma. Her body also apparently showed signs of sexual abuse, and her vaginal opening was twice the normal size of a 6-year-old. Many people suspect that the Ramseys themselves killed their daughter. Others think that a sexual predator broke into the Ramseys' home and killed JonBenet. But there are definitely a lot of weird details about this case that haven't been explained.
It's one of the most baffling mysteries in criminal history, the murder of little JonBenet Ramsey. Now a startling new twist in the case that has long defied investigators is making big headlines.
This was the Ramsey family home where JonBenet was murdered. Her parents remained under a cloud of suspicion for more than a decade until the DA finally cleared them. The case has remained unsolved for nearly 20 years, but now a private investigator believes he knows who killed JonBenet.
Private investigator Ollie Gray was hired by the Ramsey family to investigate the murder back in 1996. Gray has spent the last 20 years probing the case. He now suffers from Parkinson's disease. After all those years, he says he finally believes he knows who strangled JonBenet. The individual Ollie Gray is pointing to is a man named Michael Helgoff.
Do you believe Michael Helgoff was responsible for JonBenet's death?
I think that there's something there.
The investigator says the killer lived here, just a few miles from the Ramseys. His family's home and business have been torn down, leaving only this vacant lot. He's described as a troubled 26-year-old who died from a gunshot wound in his home less than 2 months after JonBenet was murdered. At the time, Helgoff's death was thought to be a suicide, but Ollie Gray now says he isn't so sure.
His death does not fit with a suicide. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
So that would imply then that you think Michael Helgoff may have been murdered perhaps to keep him quiet?
I think it's worth following up on.
Gray says he's obtained a pair of boots once worn by Helgoff. This is Helgoff's boot, and this is the mysterious footprint that cops found in the basement of the Ramsey house where JonBenet was slain.
You were able to compare these to the prints that were in JonBenet's basement, correct?
Yes.
And based upon your experience, was there a similarity?
Yes.
One similarity, the high-tech brand name is on both. Gray says he believes Helgoff had accomplices, but he doesn't know why anyone would have wanted to do away with a little angel called JonBenet. A member of Michael Helgoth's family says they don't believe that Michael killed JonBenet. A Boulder police spokesman says the JonBenet case is an open investigation. We receive information on a regular basis that is evaluated.
The ransom note was extremely long, 3 pages long, of ramblings on and on. What more do you need to say other than we have your daughter, we want this much money, here's what to do next? The ransom note was written inside the house as well as a practice ransom note, and just to copy this note without having to think of the content would have taken over 15 minutes. That's without the practice note. We will also look at this bizarre ransom note in more detail in episode 3.
Are Patsy Ramsey's writings getting red flagged by Boulder cops?
3 days after she gave police a 4th handwriting sample, the mother of JonBenet Ramsey is being asked for a 5th sample.
The ransom note threw everybody off. It was written on a notepad belonging to the Ramseys with one of their pens, and it took at least 15 minutes to write it. The ransom demand was for $118,000, which was exactly what John's Christmas bonus was.
The police thought Patsy wrote it. Colorado newspapers are reporting that a practice ransom note was found, written on paper found in the Ramsey home.
So there's a lot of suspicion around the note. If somebody is going to kidnap somebody, by the way, you bring the ransom note already written. You don't write it inside the house.
The weirdest part about this kidnapping, however, was that there was no kidnapping at all. JonBenet was discovered in the basement after several hours. Apparently, the police hadn't searched the house thoroughly enough to discover her body until hours after they were called. In the basement where JonBenet was found, there was a broken window and a footprint on a suitcase under the window. It's possible that if there was an intruder, this is how they got in. However, there were no footprints in the fresh snow outside the window, and there was a spider web across the window that was undisturbed. If someone had broken through the window, the spider web likely would have been broken. John Ramsey claimed that he had broken the window prior to the murder. But where did the footprint come from? Was it a badly done setup by John to make it appear that someone had broken in? Did someone really break in through the window, or was it just a coincidence? And a weird thing about the suitcase, the Ramseys claimed it wasn't theirs and they didn't know how it got in the basement. The suitcase was examined by police and it was found to contain a semen-encrusted blanket and a Dr. Seuss book. But that's not the weirdest part. The semen belonged to another family member, John's oldest son from a previous marriage who didn't live with the Ramseys. But the police were apparently able to prove that he wasn't in Boulder at the time of the murder. However, the Ramseys' neighbour, Joe Barnhill, who was the de facto owner of JonBenet's dog Jacques, reported seeing John Andrew Ramsey, John Ramsey's eldest son, walk up the drive to the Ramseys' house on the evening of Christmas Day, but later changed his story.
For 2 months, police have said John Andrew Ramsey was not in Boulder when his stepsister was murdered. Now the district attorney is questioning if that's true.
We have more work to do on John Andrew's alibi.
Most of that alibi comes from this sworn affidavit. John Andrew's mother sent it to Boulder police on January 21st, and it shows John Andrew in Atlanta from Christmas Eve through the day after Christmas. On December 24th, John Andrew and his mother went to dinner in church. The next day, they had breakfast and dinner together. Then John Andrew went to a movie with friends from the neighborhood. Finally, on December 26th, the day JonBenet was found dead in Boulder, the affidavit says her stepbrother flew from Atlanta to Minneapolis. There's even a copy of his ticket stub. According to John Andrew's mother, he was told by a flight attendant to call his home in Boulder. The affidavit says John Andrew made the call and talked to their father, who told them of the kidnapping of JonBenet. Despite this detailed alibi, Alex Hunter says investigators still have questions.
There are a couple of bases that need to be touched to be able to come to a final position on John Andrew. We're working.
Was this suitcase and semen-encrusted blanket a sign of prior abuse to John's other children too? Did they deny ownership because they knew what this suitcase could prove about John? It's also worth remembering that John Ramsey had his own plane and employed a personal pilot who he was in contact with throughout the whole ordeal. The Ramseys claimed to have found JonBenet on Boxing Day, the 26th of December 1996, but they clearly believed that she died on the 25th, as evident on her headstone. So, is it possible that John Andrew Ramsey was there on Christmas Day and that John Ramsey had his pilot flying back to Atlanta that night? Red fibres from Patsy's jumper were found in the paint tray from which the paintbrush which the garrote was made from and under JonBenet's body, which was wrapped in a blanket. Those fibres were also under the duct tape. Patsy never gave the sweater she was wearing that day to the police for forensic testing. 1 year later, she submitted an identical but brand new sweater to Boulder Police Department for testing. Fibres from John's trousers were also found on JonBenet's crotch. Some people believe that her brother Burke, 3.5 years older than JonBenet, killed her by accident and his parents covered it up.
It's been nearly 20 years since 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in her parents' home, her killer never brought to justice.
In the enduring mystery of JonBenet's murder, Burke Ramsey was the 9-year-old brother who by all accounts slept soundly in his room that Christmas of 1996, while his sister's skull was fractured and she was strangled nearby.
Her parents, John and Patsy, and 9-year-old brother Burke, were investigated but never charged.
So the question becomes, who? And the only other person in the house that night that we know of was Burke Ramsey.
So, does JonBenet's brother Burke have some memory locked away that could unlock the case?
Do you respect our privacy, please?
It's being reported that investigators want to interview JonBenet's brother Burke. But why?
The experts say investigators want to re-interview Burke in the hope that he can help them piece together some new information.
Detectives want to talk to JonBenet's 23-year-old brother, Burke, who was 9 at the time of the murder.
Many people bandied about the theory that Burke himself could be responsible for the murder.
So, when do you guys open gifts? That Christmas Eve or Christmas morning?
Christmas morning.
Do you remember what you did that morning?
I remember peeking down, and I remember seeing like an electric train and a bike, and I was super excited.
Where was your bedroom in relation to hers?
So it was like kind of around the corner, through the playroom, down the hall.
This is your room?
Yep.
After you went to bed, did you hear anything out of the ordinary at all during the night?
No.
You don't recall waking up, hearing anything in retrospect?
No.
Melanie Stanton, who lives diagonally across the street from the Ramseys, said she heard shrieks of agony coming from the Ramsey house 14 hours before JonBenet's body was found in the basement.
And she thought it came from a lower part of the house. So if that, in fact, is the child's scream, then the child's life was taken in the wee hours of the 26th of December.
It was all really sad. And my dad told me that JonBenet didn't have.
But there are some flaws to this theory. JonBenet died of both blunt force trauma to her head and strangulation. She was found tied up with a cord around her neck, and it was shown through autopsy that she was still alive when she was strangled. If Burke had accidentally killed his sister, why would she have been both beaten and strangled? The autopsy revealed that JonBenet had 2 small dots on her back that looked like they could have come from a stun gun. The autopsy also revealed that she had pineapple chunks in her stomach when she died. In the Ramseys' kitchen, a bowl of pineapple with Burke's fingerprints on it was discovered. What does this mean? Some people think it is possible that an argument over the pineapple caused Burke to attack JonBenet. There are also rumours which Burke denies that Burke had smeared feces on the wall of his sister's room and in her bed. Is it possible that JonBenet was being sexually abused? She was found with a drop of blood in her underwear and some signs that she may have suffered sexual abuse in the past. Her mother had taken her to the doctor for vaginal irritation in the past but claimed it was from bubble bath. There will often be these types of issues with abused children with water infections and other vaginal irritation. This is a massive red flag. If you are taking your very young daughter to the doctor for this type of issue at a young age, you are either already aware of the abuse or you should be very concerned. Along with the bedwetting, this is a strong indication of sexual abuse. There was DNA found on JonBenet's underwear that couldn't be matched to anyone in the family, but it also couldn't be matched to anyone in the police database. Who was this DNA from? A DNA specialist argued that it could have come from the factory where the underwear was made, and I've even watched a documentary where this expert showed us how this was possible. I will eventually link the documentary in the description when I come across it again. But as we know, there are 3 sides to every story. There's your side, there's their side, and then there's the truth. And I've also heard claims that the same DNA that was on JonBenet's underwear was found in her pyjamas, which would completely contradict the theory that the DNA on her underwear was from a worker at the factory where the underwear was made.
One of the most important findings in the autopsy was the DNA found underneath her fingernails. When murder victims are being attacked, they generally claw at their offender, and that's what JonBenet did.
This Colorado Bureau of Investigation report shows that tiny amounts of DNA were found under JonBenet's fingernails and in her underwear, and that DNA did not match John, Patsy, or anyone in the Ramsey family. Police at the time were not convinced that the DNA found at the scene belonged to the killer. Tripton Muth saw the evidence differently.
How likely is it that it would be anybody but the killer? I think it's highly unlikely that it'd be anybody else but the killer.
When questions arose about the DNA, male DNA found in the underwear that she was wearing when she was murdered. Likely saliva, not Ramsey DNA. So what do the police do about that? They leak out a story that says, according to unnamed sources, police believe that the DNA found in her underwear may have somehow gotten onto the underwear in the manufacturing process in China. Are you kidding me? But it's so much of a stretch, yet it shows you the lengths they were willing to go to try to incriminate the family in the court of public opinion.
When I heard the chief's explanation that it was a Chinese factory worker, probably, I was rolling on the floor laughing. It was the most ludicrous, far out there, maybe it was this theory I've ever heard. We might as well say, well, maybe aliens came down and did it. Can you prove that didn't happen?
In October of 2007, the waistband of JonBenet's long johns were also tested for touch DNA by the Bode Technology Group. A scraping method was used to collect any DNA that might have been present but wasn't visible. Touch DNA found on the waistband of JonBenet's pajamas matched the DNA found on her underwear.
Besides the mysterious DNA, the crime scene was completely contaminated, and the Ramseys and their friends were in the house all day before the body was found, and since the police had arrived. According to the investigator, the Ramseys acted strangely all day. While they waited for the phone call from the kidnappers, before they found the body, JonBenet's parents barely stayed in the same room with each other. The police and the family waited for the kidnappers to call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m, as indicated by the note, but nobody ever called. According to the investigator on the scene, nobody mentioned that the window had passed, which she found odd.
He said there's been a kidnapping. It involves a 6-year-old girl. There was a ransom note, a 2.5-page ransom note. And according to the ransom note, there was going to be a phone call from the author, and they were supposed to call between 8 and 10 a.m. So I was supposed to get to the house for purposes of monitoring the phone call.
8:10 a.m. Arndt arrived at the Ramsey home and meets John Ramsey for the first time.
How did he strike you?
Cordial.
Cordial?
Mm-hmm.
Upset?
Cordial.
Distraught?
Cordial.
Did it strike you at all that that was behavior that was unusual for somebody whose child was just kidnapped?
It's been my experience that people respond to trauma in different ways. So if someone has a response that is different from mine, I don't put judgment to it. I'll just note it.
And that is what she says she did all morning. Make mental notes of all things curious. 10 a.m., the deadline imposed by the writer of the ransom note for a telephone call.
10 o'clock comes and goes, and there's no acknowledgement within the house from anyone that the deadline imposed by the author of the ransom note has come and gone.
Nobody said it's 10 o'clock and the kidnappers haven't called?
Nobody said that.
Was that something else you took note of?
Absolutely.
Take me through the moment that your eyes fell on JonBenet's face as she was lying there on the floor. Did you know she was dead?
No, not at that point. I mean, I had this rush of, thank God I found her. And it was just this overwhelming sense of joy that I'd found my child. And her hands were tied over her head. She had tape on her mouth. I immediately took the tape off. Her eyes were closed.
Could you, at that point, perceive her injuries at the time? Could you see her neck and her head?
No, I didn't. There was a red spot on her throat. I didn't see the garrote because it was too deeply embedded in her skin. And I just was hoping she'd wake up and begin to realize that she wasn't going to, and just started to scream. I picked her up, carried her upstairs. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was just horrified. I couldn't speak. I was just screaming, and I took her upstairs and laid her down. I guess I was taking her to help in my mind. I didn't perhaps want to accept that she was dead. Linda Arndt knelt down beside her as I was and felt for her pulse and looked me in the eye and said, she's dead. And that's when I was just stunned. She looked very peaceful.
One of our friends ran into the room and said, we need an ambulance. Tried to dial 911. And I kept screaming, what is it? What is it? And, you know, then in just a couple minutes, then I walked into the living room.
What Linda Arndt said is that your eyes met and she knew in that moment you killed your daughter.
And I see John Ramsey carrying JonBenet up the last 3 steps from the basement. And my mind exploded. And everything that I had noted that morning that stuck out instantly made sense. I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face. And John leaned down opposite me. And his face was just inches from mine. And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget. And as we looked at each other, I remember, and I wore a shoulder holster, tucking my gun right next to me and consciously counting, I've got 18 bullets.
Why did you do that?
Because I didn't know if we'd all be alive when people showed up. I said everything made sense in that instance. And I knew what happened.
Linda Arndt has stated publicly that when she saw John with JonBenet, it was like 1,000 lights going off in her mind. She knew exactly who had killed JonBenet.
At one point, she said she was so worried that she was in the presence of a bad person that she was counting the bullets that she had on her body, and that she had 18 bullets because she feared she might have to shoot her way out of there.
Frightening and incompetent, beyond incompetent. Shouldn't have been a police officer.
There's a detective, Linda Arndt, who deals with various emotional cases, not a homicide detective, not a kidnapping detective, because the Boulder Police Department didn't have those experts.
Is your interpretation, she thought she was going to have to shoot everybody? That
Yeah.
she went all in on
I think her comment was, I looked around and counted the people and then counted the bullets in my gun. I mean, this is crazy stuff. Absolutely crazy stuff. Linda Arndt, the lead detective that was there, went on national television a few months ago and said, I didn't act right. I was too calm, cordial.
The 911 call made by Patsy was also very odd, but I will cover this in detail in the next episode.
We were kidnapping. Sorry, please explain to me what's going on, okay?
Let me assure you that I did not kill JonBenet.
Okay, what's your name? Are you Patsy Ramsey? I'm the mother. Oh my God! Please.
I did not have anything to do with it. I love that child with my whole of my heart and soul.
I'm the mother. I love that child. This is not how a loving mother describes herself in relation to her child. But again, we will cover the 911 call in detail in the next episode. Although many people suspect the Ramseys, a few other suspects in the case have been considered. Unsurprisingly, none of them seem to be from whatever small foreign faction it is that was mentioned in the ransom note.
The highlight of the 25th was really a visit for dinner at Fleet and Priscilla White's home.
Fleet White was John Ramsey's best friend. Fleet White became a suspect and was interviewed 18 times by the authorities.
When you came home that night, JonBenet had fallen asleep on the ride home, so you carried her in.
I laid her on the bed, and then Patsy went up later and I think put her pajamas on and tucked her in.
I believe him. I believe he carried her lifeless body into the house. But is it possible that JonBenet was already dead? I see a very clear pattern of these upper middle class and upper class paedophiles, such as in the Madeleine McCann case. They stick together, they holiday together, they celebrate together, and I believe the children are a big part, if not the biggest part, about these holidays and parties, and not in the way an innocent mind would think. I'll leave it at that. Some people also believe that JonBenet was a victim of MK Ultra, which is a proven conspiracy within the CIA to mind control using LSD and sexual abuse. Look it up. Families of the victims have actually won court cases. Anyway, some people believe she was a victim of MK Ultra and now goes by the name Katy Perry. I'm definitely not going to cover that theory, but if you know anything about MK Ultra, then you'll know that that theory isn't as crazy as it may sound. So that's it for the first episode. The next episode will look at some statement analysis of the 911 call made by Patsy. Episode 3 will cover the bizarre 3-page ransom note. Episode 4 will cover Burke Ramsey's Dr. Phil exclusive interview. Episode 5 will look at various interviews given by John and Patsy Ramsey. And episode 6 will look into the other theories and suspects. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, pretty please give me a thumbs up. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Peace! You've been watching a ReeTV documentary.